This is the Church of St. Paul in the Desert.
In the name of God, amen. The worst thing I could ever do as a kid growing up in Virginia in the summertime was to announce to my mother I was bored, because they had a very large garden, flowers, landscape, and vegetable garden. And so there were always weeds to be pulled. And if you think it's been humid this week here, no. Virginia in the summertime is humid. But part of the story that we hear in Jesus' parable of the weeds and the tares, as we heard it growing up, is about the weeds that are in among the wheat. And there's an old adage about that. It's much more time-consuming to weed than ever to plant a garden. And as you know, Sheila is a very good gardener, and her tomatoes and eggplants are well known. But every once in a while, she has to remind me that if I enjoy the fruits of her labor, I need to weed the beds. Along that line, someone said that when weeding, the best way to make sure you are removing a weed and not a valuable plant is to pull it up. And if it pulls up easily, it's usually a valuable plant. The other option is to pull everything up, and whatever comes back quickly, those are weeds. I mentioned to Clark, one of the things I didn't say at 8 o'clock was that Sheila was also sent out by her mother to weed her garden, at which point she proceeded to pull up her mother's prized hollyhocks. You know, hollyhocks in the East kind of grow everywhere, and some regard them as beautiful and some not so much. So she thought they were weeds. I happen to like Queen Anne's lace. It is a weed. It also carries chiggers by the handful. But the question is, what is the point of this story? And Matthew's gospel is full of parables that talk about the allegorical interpretation of these parables. I think there's much more going on here. And I would have to say that in light of one theologian well known by many, Mr. Rogers, those of you who remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he told the story, and he was very much about acceptance and inclusion. He was probably one of the people out there in TV land who really talked about inclusion and one's neighbors. But he tells the story, it's an old Cherokee fable, about the two wolves. And it goes like this. He said, one of the two wolves is evil. Anger, envy, greed, arrogance, self-pity, gossip, resentment, and false pride. The other was good. Joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, generosity, truth, compassion. And they struggle within each and every one of us at some level. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that to be true. And the grandson of the teller of that tale turned to his grandfather and said, "So which one wins? Which wolf do you think will win?" And the grandfather replied, "The one that I feed. The one that I feed. The one that I acknowledge, the one that I give power to, And for each and every one of us, that struggle between good and evil is there. I remember the cartoons of my childhood, and there was always the little angel on one shoulder and the little devil on the other side. And that ultimately is true. Within each and every one of us is this ongoing struggle. Who's going to win? Who is the one that prevails in our lives? How do we make that determination? The part of the story that I think sometimes is overlooked is that when Jesus retells the story, is that he reminds them not to pull up the plants early. We, on the other hand, do that with amazing regularity because we know better. We know better. And we tend to spend a lot of time judging one another. And so we pull them up and cast them out and talk about God's love for us, but not for them necessarily. Because, of course, we know not so much. But it is a part of the world in which we live. And we easily go down that road. We tend to easily go down that road. The story of Jacob's ladder is the first of the two stories about the dream sequence that Jacob has. And one of the things that we need to remember is that Jacob was the trickster, stole his brother's birthright, always had a little scheme. But God is the initiator. God's relationship with Jacob shows that God's saving actions are initiated by God and are not dependent on human faithfulness. Initiated by God, the one who continues to love us in spite of our stumbles, in spite of our arrogance, in spite of our judgments. God initiates. God reaches out to us. And like the choices that we make between good and evil, we either choose to hear and pay attention, or we choose not to. Or we choose not to. We at times in our own arrogance forget that very quickly. Caroline Lewis, who I've mentioned before, is a Lutheran pastor and professor of homiletics. And one of the responses in the midst of that, she said, she put this on her Facebook page, and it's something maybe we need to think about. When they discover the center of the universe, a lot of people will be disappointed they are not it. And that's kind of where we tend to begin. We kind of think we're the center of the universe. And I think there's someone else who is the center of the universe. The one who came into this world, the one who became flesh, was enfleshed, in order to show us the love that God had for us and was willing to die because of that love. But one of the things that Matthew does at the end of each of those less parables, or did last week, and it did it again this week. Those who have ears, listen. Those who hear, listen. Part of the problem in the process is we may have ears, but there's a really big difference between hearing and listening, and even comprehension. And sometimes it's that give and take and understanding that what someone says here and what someone listening hears is somewhere maybe in between, if you will. Jacob, in the Old Testament lesson, makes one of those profound statements that we tend to kind of gloss. We miss it sometimes in not paying attention. After this incredible dream and setting up a pillar, he makes the statement, God was surely in this place, and I did not know it. How often do we miss God in the midst of our struggles, our attempt to discern, recognizing his presence in our midst? Do we in fact hear what we want to hear and not hear what we don't want to hear? I know I'm as guilty as the next person in that. What do we hear? What are we called to do and be about as the holy people of God, the children of God, the children of light? To hear the good news and proclaim that to one another again and again and again. And be reminded that God doesn't give up on us, but continues to love us and love us and love us. In spite of our foibles, in spite of our clay feet, in spite of our inability to see the wart on our own face, when we sure as heck can find the wart on everybody else's face. Time and again. Martin Buber, another great theologian, tells the story in the Tales of Hasidim. A disciple secretly wrote down all the teachings he had heard from the Baal Shem. One day, the Baal Shem saw a demon going through the house. In his hand was a book. And the Baal Shem asked him, "What book is that you have in your hand?" "That is the book," the demon replied, "of which you are the author." Then the Baal Shem knew that someone was secretly setting down in writing what he had said. He gathered all his people around him and asked, "Who of you is writing down what I teach you?" And the disciple who had been taking notes said it was he, and brought the master what he had written. The Baal Shem studied it for a long time, page by page. Then he said, "In all of this, there is not a single word that I said. You were not listening for the sake of heaven. So the power of evil used you for its sheath, and your ears heard what I did not say. Let the wise hear and live accordingly." There is always time. There is always the presence of God here and now. Do we hear and do we see the good news of Jesus Christ? Amen.